Now we are going to discuss wound healing, tissue repair and scar. So first of all, see the wound healing. So what is the definition of wound? Yes, wound is breach in continuity of skin or surface epithelium. It's the breach in continuity of skin or surface epithelium. And what is wound healing? Is the mechanism by which body restore the integrity of injured part. This wound healing is very important topic. It is asked in pathology, it is asked in surgery, so we are going to discuss in detail. Generally, this wound healing is having three phases. First is inflammatory phase, second is proliferative phase, and third is remodeling phase. So see the phases. This is the inflammatory phase. So first is inflammatory phase, second is proliferative phase, and third is remodeling phase. Now see what happens in inflammatory phase. It begins just after wounding or just after injury, and it is going to last for 2 to 3 days. Now what is the problem? Whenever there is wounding or injury, there is bleeding, and if there is bleeding, what happens in the vessels? There is vasoconstriction and there is thrombus formation. So because of this vasoconstriction or thrombus formation, what happens in inflammatory phase? There is hemostasis, and because of this hemostasis, there is formation of blood clot. So what happens here? There is vasoconstriction and thrombus formation. Clear? After that, there is formation of scab. So can you see scab? And in inflammatory phase, there is scab formation. Simultaneously, here you can notice that there is recruitment of which cells? There is recruitment of fibroblast and macrophages. Clear? So see the important points related to inflammatory phase. It is going to last for 2 to 3 days. Clear? And in this, there is activation. After thrombus formation, there is inflammation, and because of this inflammation, there is recruitment of which two cells? Fibroblast and macrophages. So scab formation and recruitment of fibroblast and macrophages. Clear? Now see what happens in proliferative phase. So in proliferative phase, there should be proliferation of what? Fibroblast. So here you can see that there is fibroblast proliferation, and because of this fibroblast proliferation, there is deposition of collagen, glycosaminoglycans and proteoglycans. Simultaneously, if you notice here that there is angiogenesis also, so formation of new capillary loops. And if you compare the size of wound from inflammatory phase, can you see the size here and see the size here? What happens? There is wound contraction also. So these are the changes which are occurring in the proliferative phase. So see, there is, here you can see fibroblast proliferation in proliferative phase, and because of this fibroblast proliferation, there is production of what? Collagen, glycosaminoglycans and proteoglycans. And what else? Formation of new capillary loops, that's known as angiogenesis. So in proliferative phase, there is angiogenesis also. What is the problem? That here the collagen is deposited in the random fashion. And which type of collagen is deposited? Type 3. So because of deposition of type 3 collagen in the random fashion, there is one advantage also. What? There is increased tensile strength of the wound. So after angiogenesis, there is increased tensile strength. And why there is increased tensile strength? Because of type 3 collagen. Type 3 collagen. So apart from increase in tensile strength of wound, there is wound contraction. So we saw that the size of wound decreased in the proliferative phase. Now what happens in remodeling? There is remodeling. So initially there was deposition of type 3 collagen. Now type 1 collagen starts replacing type 3 collagen till the ratio of 4:1 is achieved. So in remodeling phase, what happens? There is remodeling. So type 1 collagen it's going to replace type 3. So type 1 collagen replaces type 3 till the ratio of 4:1 is achieved. So the ratio of type 1 and type 3 collagen is 4:1. Because of this, what happens? Finally, if you see the size again, what happens? There is decreased size, means in this case there is wound contraction. In this case there is decreased vascularity also, and there is increased wound strength. So because of this remodeling, there is realignment of collagen fibers. So there is wound contraction and there is decreased vascularity. So these are the important points related to the 3 phases. Now 3 one-liner questions are asked frequently related to the wound healing. So the first question, that what is the cause of increase in tensile strength of the wound? And the cause is, it's the maturation of collagen. So maturation of collagen is responsible for increased tensile strength. Second, maximum wound strength is achieved after how many weeks or how many months of the injury? So the maximum wound strength is achieved at 12th week or 3rd month post injury. At 12th week or 3rd month post injury. Now, what is the maximum wound strength achieved? Okay, so it's not 100%, obviously, it's 80% of uninjured skin strength. So the maximum wound strength achieved is approximately 80% of uninjured skin strength. So these are 3 one-liner questions asked frequently. Now see the list of factors which affect the wound healing. There are 2 types of factors. One is local factors and second is systemic factors. So see, factors affecting wound healing. Local factors and systemic factors. So any kind of infection near the wound impairs the wound healing. If there is ischemia or presence of foreign body, if there is collection of blood or hematoma, all these factors are going to affect the wound healing. You must be knowing that if there is movement or there is any kind of mechanical stress, so that also impairs the wound healing. And sometimes if in relation to wound there is presence of necrotic tissue, it is also going to impair the wound healing. So that's why if you have seen any wound and there is presence of necrosed material, you have seen some resident is doing debridement and removing that necrotic tissue. What are the systemic factors? You have seen in the wards that if a patient is having wound and it is not healing, what we have to rule out? What? Diabetes mellitus. We have to rule out whether patient is immunocompromised or not, whether patient received any kind of radiotherapy or not. Why? Because if patient received any kind of radiation in that particular wound bed, radiation is going to cause obliterative end arthritis, and because of this obliterative end arthritis, the perfusion of that wound is affected. So what are the list of systemic factors? So diabetes mellitus, ionizing radiation. Immunocompromised state means if the patient is having HIV positive status or patient is a transplant recipient. Now if patient is receiving certain drugs, the drugs which are going to cause immunosuppression, like patient is receiving steroids, or a transplant recipient who is receiving what? Immunosuppressive agents. Malnutrition is also going to impair the wound healing, especially if the patient is having vitamin C deficiency, zinc deficiency. Clear? And systemic illness like uremia, jaundice and malignancy, all these are going to impair the wound healing. So this list is very, very important. It is asked frequently in exam. So we discussed what is the definition of wound. Wound is breach in the continuity of skin or surface epithelium. Clear? This wound is further divided into 2 types. Simple wound and complex wound. So wound is further divided into 2 types. One is simple and the second is complex wound. Clear? So what happens in simple wound? Only skin and subcutaneous tissue is involved, right? And what happens in complex wound? Apart from skin, underlying structures are also involved. Underlying structures means muscle, bone, tendon, and not only underlying structures, there is presence of devitalized tissue also. Clear? So in simple wound, definition of simple wound and complex wound. In simple wound, there is involvement of only skin plus subcutaneous tissue. Clear? And in complex wound, apart from skin, there is involvement of underlying structures like nerves, vessels, muscles, tendon. Clear? Plus, there should be presence of devitalized tissue. So there is presence of devitalized tissue. From the last 3-4 years, one question which is frequently asked related to the wound, and that is surgical classification of the wound. What is surgical classification of the wound? So first have a look. There are 4 classes of wound according to the surgical classification: type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4. What is type 1? Type 1 is clean wound. What is the meaning of clean? Means wound is clean. It means it's not infected, so there is no infection and no inflammation. So in clean wound, no infection, no inflammation. Simultaneously see respiratory tract, GIT means gastrointestinal tract, and GUT means genitourinary tract. This is not entered. So in class 1 wound, that is known as clean wound, there is no infection, no inflammation. Respiratory tract, gastrointestinal tract and genitourinary tract is not entered. Type 2 is clean contaminated wound. So class 2 is clean contaminated. It means there is contamination, still it's clean. It means respiratory tract, gastrointestinal tract or genitourinary tract is entered under controlled condition. What do you mean by under controlled condition? Means before surgery, if patient underwent bowel preparation and if you are going to perform the resection, what happens? There is contamination, but what? There is no gross spillage of fecal matter. So this is clean contaminated wound in which respiratory tract, GIT and GUT is entered under controlled conditions. Class 3 is contaminated wound. What is contaminated wound? It means the wound is already contaminated, like fresh accidental open wounds in which there is contamination with soil, and sometimes there is accidental spillage from GIT. So suppose bowel preparation is not there and there is accidental spillage from GIT. So here it's contaminated. And class 4 is dirty wound, means wound is already dirty. It means the microorganism is already present in the wound, and what kind of inflammation is there? Purulent inflammation. Purulent inflammation means there is presence of frank pus in class 4 or dirty wound. So this is basic related to the surgical classification of wounds. Let's discuss this topic in detail. So classification of surgical wound, first is class 1, and this is also known as clean wound. So since the wound is clean, here there is no infection, and no inflammation. Simple. Clear? And in this case, GIT, GUT and respiratory tract. GIT, GUT and respiratory tract, these are not entered. Clear? So whenever we perform surgery, generally cases we are going to close the wound primarily. So these wounds are generally closed primarily. Usually we don't insert any drain, and if you are supposed to insert a drain, it should be a closed drain. So what? Here the wound is closed primarily, plus minus drain. Usually drain is not inserted, and if it's inserted, it should be a closed drainage system. So this is clean wound. Now see the most important aspect. They will give you the examples and they will ask you, this wound is or this wound falls under which category? So see the examples of clean wound. So inguinal hernia surgery, mastectomy, thyroidectomy, if you go for joint replacement, or abdominal aortic aneurysm repair. Clear? So all these surgeries are included in the clean wound. Now class 2, and the class 2 is clean contaminated. So clean contaminated wound. Clear? So it's very easy to remember. There is contamination, still wound is clean. So respiratory tract, GIT and GUT is entered under controlled condition. So here respiratory tract, GIT and genitourinary tract, it is entered under controlled condition. Clear? Okay, now see what is the meaning of entered under control condition. Imagine that I'm going to perform what? CBD exploration. And if I'm going to perform CBD exploration, I will enter inside CBD, and what will happen? There is some bile leak. Elective GI resection or elective gastrointestinal surgery, in which suppose we have to perform the elective colonic resection or gastrectomy. So in these cases also I'm entering into GIT, but since bowel preparation has been done, and that's why what happens, we are going to enter the GIT, but it is under controlled condition. So what kind of wound is this? Clean contaminated. So what are the examples of clean contaminated wound? So if we perform cholecystectomy and there is some bile leak, we perform CBD exploration. In that also there are chances of what? Bile leak. And in elective GI surgery, especially when we go for GI resection, since bowel preparation has been done, clear? So it is entry under controlled condition. So examples: elective colonic resection or elective gastrectomy after bowel preparation. So these are the examples of class 2 or clean contaminated wound. Now see class 3, and class 3 is contaminated. So there is gross contamination present, and we discussed examples like open fresh accidental wounds. There is contamination with soil. So if there is open fresh accidental wound, okay, and see in OT, if there is some major break in sterile technique or there is gross spillage from the GIT. How gross spillage is going to occur? Suppose a patient is having intestinal obstruction and we are performing surgery, and you created iatrogenic perforation, and because of this iatrogenic perforation, what happens? There is gross spillage. So it also includes major break in sterile technique, major break in sterile technique, or gross spillage from GIT. Clear? Because of iatrogenic perforation. So what you have noticed here, that here there is acute inflammation, but frank pus is not there. So what kind of inflammation is seen in cases of contaminated wound? Here we can see, or we can find, acute non-purulent inflammation. Again, lots of questions are asked related to examples. So see the examples of class 3 or contaminated wound. So if there is appendicular or gastric perforation, clear? What happens? There is gross spillage from gastric perforation. And if patient is having intestinal obstruction and there is iatrogenic perforation, or we are going to perform the enterotomy, then also there is gross spillage. And in cases of human bite and open fracture, right, these are the examples of class 3 or contaminated wound. Now see the class 4. Class 4, it's dirty wound, and two important points related to this, that first, in this case, organism is already present and there is purulent inflammation, it means there is presence of frank pus. So here organism is already present in the wound and there is purulent inflammation. Clear? It means there is presence of frank pus in the wound. Now in these cases, suppose a patient is having old traumatic wound and there is already devitalized tissue, means necrosed tissue. So if there is old traumatic wound with devitalized tissue, or sometimes there is accidental or gross contamination. Suppose there is perforation peritonitis and after perforation peritonitis there is gross contamination. So these are included here. So in dirty wound, if a patient is having old traumatic wound with, be careful, with devitalized tissue, okay, and you can see since organism is present, so there is evidence of clinical infection or there is perforation with perforation peritonitis with high degree of contamination, high degree of contamination. Okay, so what you have noticed in these cases, that organism is already present and there is purulent inflammation of frank pus. What are the examples of dirty wound? So if patient is having perforation, perforated diverticulitis, because in that case also there is presence of fecal matter, there is fecal peritonitis. If there is presence of frank pus or what kind of soft tissue infection? Necrotizing soft tissue infection, it means there is presence of devitalized tissue. So these are the questions which are frequently asked related to surgical classification of wounds. There is a second group of questions which are asked, and it was asked many times in AIIMS, that how much is the risk of infection in these categories of wound and in which cases antibiotic prophylaxis is required. Okay, so first question, that how much is the risk of infection in the various classes? So in class 1, that's clean, the risk of infection is 5%. How much is the risk of infection in class 2 or clean contaminated wound? It was asked in AIIMS and it is 10%. How much is the risk of infection in class 3? It's 20 to 30%, and in class 4, that's dirty wound, it's 30 to 40%. Clear? Now see how to remember. In class 1 it's 5, class 2 it's 10, class 3 it's 20, class 4 is 40. So you have to just double the incidence of infection. 1, 5, 2, 10, 3, 2 times of 10, 20, and 4, 2 times of 20, 40. So 5, 10, 20, 40. Easiest way to remember. Now see, antibiotic prophylaxis is required or not. So if wound is clean, it's usually not required. It's usually not required. And in class 2, that's clean contaminated, it is usually required. Usually required means in certain cases you may not give it. In class 3, if it's contaminated, it's definitely required. So it should be given in all cases. Right? And if the wound is dirty, we are not going for antibiotic prophylaxis. We have to go for the treatment. So here, treatment is required, not the prophylaxis. So in class 4, treatment is required. Here, treatment is required, not the prophylaxis. Then you must be knowing one famous question which was asked in AIIMS and later it was repeated in many other exams, that how we can prevent the surgical site infection or hospital acquired infection. One of the most important steps to prevent surgical site infection is what? Hand washing. So whenever we are attending the patients, before attending the patient, we should wash our hands, especially during examination. So what are the important steps to prevent surgical site infection? So see, how to avoid surgical site infection. Clear? So this list is very important and many questions were asked. First, the most important step, one of the most important step is hand washing. Clear? So whenever we are supposed to examine any patient, we have to wash our hands, right? Second, minimal duration of hospital stay or minimal length of hospital stay. Why? Because if the patient is going to stay for longer duration, what is the problem? There is increased incidence of hospital acquired infection. Clear? So to avoid this hospital acquired infection, the hospital stay should be kept minimum. Avoid pre-operative shaving. Why? You have seen, whenever we take the patient for surgery, we go for part preparation, so we shave that area. What is the problem? Because of this shaving, there are minor cuts. So minor cuts are there in the skin, and because of these minor cuts, what happens? There is growth of organism. So that's why we should avoid pre-operative shaving. There should be antibiotic skin preparation, and it should be standardized. For elective gastrointestinal surgery, in which we have to perform some kind of GI resection, we have to perform anastomosis, generally we go for what? Bowel preparation. And the most important aspect is this one. Clear? What? Antibiotic prophylaxis. Minimum 10 to 15 questions were asked related to antibiotic prophylaxis, that in which class we are supposed to give it. So we discussed class 1 not required, class 2 usually required, class 3 required in all cases, and in class 4 treatment is required, not the prophylaxis. Now comes the question, what kind of antibiotic is given? It's IV antibiotic. And what is the best time to give antibiotic prophylaxis? It should be given at the time of induction. At the time of induction, and sometimes duration is mentioned in the surgery. Clear? So it should be done, or it should be given 1 hour before surgery. So best time to give antibiotic prophylaxis at the time of induction or 1 hour before surgery. Now see, sometimes before surgery patients are in the pre-operative rooms, and if there is hypothermia, if the temperature is not maintained, patient is having hypothermia, even pre-operative hypothermia increases the risk of surgical site infection. So we have to avoid pre-operative hypothermia. You must be knowing that there are two kinds of suture. One is monofilament, in which there is single strand, and one is polyfilament, in which there are multiple strands which are braided together. And if multiple strands are there in polyfilament suture, you can see in between these strands there are spaces, and these spaces are known as crevices. So what is the problem? In these crevices there is growth of bacteria. So if we are supposed to use the suture to prevent surgical site infection, which suture is preferred? It's the monofilament suture which is preferred over polyfilament. So which suture? We have to prefer monofilament suture over polyfilament, because in polyfilament suture there is presence of crevices which increases the risk of infection. Whenever we are performing the suturing, there should be proper wound apposition. Why? Because if the proper wound apposition is not there, what happens? There is creation of a formation of dead space, and sometimes there is hematoma. So if there is dead space or hematoma, this also increases the risk of infection. So there should be proper wound apposition, and we should prevent the formation of dead space and hematoma. So these are the methods by which we can avoid surgical site infection. After that, questions are asked related to classification of wound closure and healing. So there are three types: healing by primary intention, healing by secondary intention, and healing by tertiary intention. So see, what is healing by primary intention? So healing by primary intention is also known as healing by first intention. Right? And what is the classical example you have seen in surgery? That we have to give incision, and after giving incision, so there is clean incision, and we have to perform the suturing. So we are going to suture the wound, and after that you can see that there is hairline scar. Clear? So the best scar is seen after healing by primary intention. Now see, second, healing by secondary intention, also known as second intention. What is the main problem in these patients? These patients have wound gaping. And if there is gaping in the wound, what? It's very difficult to close the wound. So these wounds are left open, means these are not closed. And what happens over a period of time, you will notice that over a period of time, granulation tissue appears in the wound. So there is appearance of granulation tissue. Clear? And after appearance of granulation tissue, what happens in the wound? Here you can notice that there is wound contraction. So after granulation tissue, there is wound contraction and then epithelialization. So you will notice here that there is epithelialization. Clear? And because of this epithelialization, wound contraction, since it was not closed primarily, you will notice that there is large scar. So can you see here? There is large scar if healing occurs by secondary intention. The third is healing by tertiary intention, and this is known as delayed primary intention healing. Okay, delayed primary intention healing. So you got my point. Generally we are going to follow the steps of primary intention, but it is delayed. What is the meaning? See, this is the wound. Clear? And generally these are the wounds which are not opposed, and these are the wounds which are sometimes having some kind of contamination. So we are going to clean the wound, we are supposed to perform the dressing, and whenever there is appearance of granulation tissue, if there is appearance of granulation tissue, after appearance of granulation tissue, can you see, we are going to perform the suturing. So suturing is done after appearance of granulation tissue. So what kind of suturing is done? There is late suturing. So if we perform the late suturing, obviously the scar is not hairline scar like primary intention healing. But what is the good thing? That here the scar is somewhat better than healing by secondary intention. Clear? So here there is late suturing with wide scar, but this scar is better than the scar which is seen in healing by secondary intention. So these three are also asked in exam frequently. After that, there is a definition which is frequently asked. This is one liner question, that what is the definition of chronic wound? Clear? So any wound that does not heal within 3 months. Duration 3 months. So any wound that does not heal within, this is the question, within 3 months. Clear? Now see, why there is delay in healing. We discussed that in wound healing there are 3 phases. One is inflammatory, second was proliferative, and third was remodeling. So the delay can occur in any phase, inflammatory, proliferative or remodeling, but mainly the delay is in which phase? It is most frequently seen in inflammatory phase. So in chronic wounds, you will notice that there is delay mainly in which phase? Inflammatory phase. Clear? And you have seen patients who are having chronic wounds, especially in the surgery. Which patients? The patient who are having quadriplegia or paraplegia, the patients who are confined to wheelchair or confined to the bed. So these patients have increased risk of formation of pressure sore or pressure ulcer. What are the sites? Ischium, sacrum, greater trochanter. So the example of chronic wound, it's the pressure ulcer or pressure sore. Clear? Generally in chronic wound, what is the treatment? See, prevention is better. So we have to promote the healing. So in majority of cases, what? Conservative management. So management, most of the patients are managed conservatively. We will discuss pressure ulcer in detail. Then questions are asked that what are the indications of surgery in chronic wound? Indications of surgery. So one common sense indication, that if there is failure of conservative management, wound is still not healing. So if there is failure of conservative management, and in certain cases patient is having intractable pain. So if the patient is having intractable pain, in that case also we should go for surgical intervention. Now see this injury and tell me what is the name of this injury, because this was asked in both AIIMS and NEET. What you can see here you can see that skin, apart from skin you can see subcutaneous fat. So here the skin and subcutaneous fat, it is stripped off from underlying fascia. Why? Because of avulsion. So you have seen, because of sometimes road traffic accident, when the vehicle tire is going to move over the limb, there is avulsion. So skin and subcutaneous fat is stripped off from underlying fascia. And if it is stripped off, what are the structures which are exposed? Here you can see that there is exposed bone. Here you can see that there is exposed neurovascular structures, exposed muscles, tendons. Clear? So what is the definition of this? Is what is the name of this injury? This is known as degloving injury, also known as avulsion injury. So first the name, it is known as degloving injury, and this was the question which was asked in NEET. Definition here: skin plus subcutaneous fat, it is stripped from underlying fascia. Clear? So what are the structures which are exposed? So in these patients you will find exposed neurovascular structures, exposed bone, exposed muscle and or tendon. So these structures are exposed. Another topic which is asked both in surgery as well as in orthopedics, and it is one of the favorite topic of AIIMS people because it is being asked from last 3-4 years continuously. And what's that? Compartment syndrome. Now see, generally this compartment syndrome is commonly seen in upper limb injuries or lower limb injuries. So it is seen in lower limb injuries. Open or closed lower limb injuries? Closed. What is the problem? So whenever there is closed lower limb injury, what is the problem? In one of the muscle compartment, because of edema, because of hematoma, there is increased pressure. So whenever there is increased pressure in the compartment, and this pressure is more than 30 mmHg, because if the pressure is more than 30 mmHg, it is more than capillary occlusive pressure. And if the pressure is more than 30, perfusion stops. So because of this high pressure, perfusion stops, and because of this there is ischemia. So what is the problem in compartment syndrome? There is ischemia in one particular compartment. Clear? And we discussed that anywhere in the body at any point of time, if there is ischemia, what is the most common manifestation? There is pain. So these patients are having severe pain, and if we are going to stretch the muscle of affected compartment, what happens? There is pain on passive stretching. There are sensory disturbances also. There are certain patients of compartment syndrome in which at the time of presentation the distal pulses are palpable. So see, presence of distal pulses cannot rule out compartment syndrome. Why? Because distal pulses are palpable in early stage. Absence of distal pulses are the late sign. So we are going to discuss in detail this compartment syndrome. Compartment syndrome, so we discussed, it is generally seen in or more common in closed lower limb injuries, and the pressure in compartment should be more than 30 mmHg, and because of that perfusion stops and patient is having ischemia. And because of the ischemia, what are the clinical features? So these patients have severe pain, and this clue is generally there in the exam, that on passive stretching of that particular group of muscle there was pain. There is sensory disturbances also present distally, and absence of distal pulses. It's a late sign. And absence of distal pulses, this is not mandatory for diagnosis of compartment syndrome. So how we are going to make the diagnosis of compartment syndrome? Since there is increased pressure in the compartment, so insert a catheter with pressure monitor in that compartment and measure the pressure. if the pressure is more than 30 mmHg, so what? It's a case of compartment syndrome. So how we make the diagnosis? Measure the pressure, measure the compartment pressure. Clear? And how we measure? We insert a catheter with pressure monitor, and whenever the pressure is more than 30 mmHg, you have to remember this value because this value is asked. And when this much pressure is there, what? Perfusion stops because this is more than capillary occlusive pressure. Now coming to the treatment. So whenever we are going to suspect that patient is having compartment syndrome, means patient is having signs and symptoms of compartment syndrome, or the pressure is more than 30 mmHg, in these cases what we have to do? We have to relieve the pressure by performing fasciotomy. And see, in fasciotomy we have to give two incision, one on the medial aspect and one on the lateral aspect. So longitudinal incision is given on the medial aspect and lateral aspect. So two longitudinal incisions for fasciotomy. Question: what is incised in the fasciotomy? Fasciotomy. So we are going to incise skin, subcutaneous tissue and fascia. And whenever we are performing the fasciotomy, you will notice that the muscle will bulge from the fascia. So what's the treatment? We go for fasciotomy. Clear? So first, what are the indications of fasciotomy? If the patient is having signs and symptoms of compartment syndrome, or the compartment pressure is more than 30 mmHg. What are the structures which are incised? So the structures incised, you can see, we are going to incise skin, after that subcutaneous tissue or fat, and after that what? Fascia. Clear? How many incisions? We have to give two longitudinal incisions to release the pressure, and one over medial side and one over lateral side. Lots of people are doing this mistake when they are going to treat the compartment syndrome, that they give the incision only on one side. This is not very effective. So incision should be given on both sides. And see, the moment you are going to incise the fascia, what happens? After incision of fascia, you can see there is muscle bulging. So you can see muscle bulging from the fascia. Now see, in this bedridden patient, there is presence of ulcer over the sacrum. Can you see? There is presence of ulcer over the sacrum in this bedridden patient. And what is the name of this ulcer? This is known as pressure ulcer or pressure sore. So what is the name of this condition? This is pressure ulcer. Other name of this condition is pressure sore. Okay, so what is the problem here? There is tissue ulceration and necrosis due to external prolonged pressure. So when these patients are confined in the bed for long duration of time, there is external pressure because of bony prominences, and at those sites patient is going to develop the ulcer. What are the other names of pressure sore or pressure ulcer? So it is also known as bed sore, also known as decubitus ulcer, trophic ulcer or penetrating ulcer. Now see, what is the pathophysiology of this pressure ulcer or pressure sore? So generally what happens when patient is confined in the bed for long duration of time in one particular posture, or patient is confined in the wheelchair for long duration of time in one particular posture, especially at bony prominences. Can you see? Especially at bony prominences, what is the problem? The external pressure exceeds capillary occlusive pressure or capillary occlusion pressure, and whenever this external pressure is more than 30 mmHg, just like in compartment syndrome we discussed, so whenever the external pressure is more than capillary occlusion pressure, and that is more than 30 mmHg, what happens at that point of time? The perfusion stops, and if perfusion stops, then there is ischemia, and because of this ischemia, what's the problem? There is necrosis and ulceration. Clear? This is one mechanism, and there are other patients who are having malnutrition or impaired nutrition, they have ischemia because of occlusion of vessels, or their sensory supply is not intact, so they have neurological deficit. So these are certain other mechanisms which also lead to pressure ulcer. Now see, especially the patients who are having neurological deficit, and whenever we are going to transport these patients, are going to shift the patients in the bed, and we are not very careful, what happens? There is friction of skin against the surface, right? And because of this friction also, what happens? There is formation of ulcer, and that is also known as pressure sore or pressure ulcer. Now see, this pressure sore or pressure ulcer is preventable, so you have to be very careful. So what is the incidence of this pressure ulcer or pressure sore? It is generally seen in 5% of hospitalized patients. Now one question which is frequently asked related to pressure sore or pressure ulcer is that what is the most common site of pressure ulcer or pressure sore? Now see, the site depends upon the type of immobilization or in what position patient is immobilized. Now see, first, suppose the patient is wheelchair bound. Okay, so if patient is wheelchair bound, can you see the maximum pressure is at ischial tuberosity? So this is a common site. Now if patient is in supine position, see the pressure points, can you see? This is heel or calcaneum, sacrum, olecranon, scapula, and this occipital protuberance. Now if patient is in lateral position, so in lateral position you can notice what are the points? Malleolus, which one? Lateral malleolus. Here medial and lateral condyles of the femur, and here you can see greater trochanter, acromion process, ear. And now imagine if patient is prone, if patient is lying in the prone position, so zygoma, acromion process, breast especially in the females, pubic symphysis, here patella and metatarsals. These are the pressure points. You will find most of the patients which are either wheelchair bound or in supine position or in lateral position. So if you notice, what is the most common site? The most common site is ischium, followed by greater trochanter, followed by sacrum. Clear? So what are the most common sites in pressure ulcer or pressure sore? So overall, the most common site is ischium, followed by greater trochanter, followed by sacrum, followed by heel, followed by malleolus. In malleolus, it is more common in the lateral malleolus as compared to medial, followed by occiput. So how to remember? It's very easy to remember. See, Indira Gandhi Stadium, inauguration by Home Minister's Office. So what is the mnemonic? Indira Gandhi Stadium, inauguration by Home Minister Office. So this is ischium, greater trochanter, sacrum, heel, malleolus, lateral followed by medial, and occiput. Now this question is asked both in medicine and surgery, that what are the neurological causes of pressure sore or pressure ulcer? So see, the neurological causes. So the neurological causes of pressure ulcer include syringomyelia. You have seen spina bifida, or the patient who is having spinal cord injury. Patients in whom there is neurological deficit because of peripheral neuritis, or sometimes there is peripheral nerve injury. You will also find trophic ulcers in the patients of leprosy, diabetic neuropathy, patients who are having paraplegia or tapes dorsalis. Clear? So this is the list, which is very, very important. This list is frequently asked. So how to remember? The mnemonic is special DPT. What is the mnemonic? Special DPT. Okay. So syringomyelia, spina bifida, spinal injury, peripheral injuries, neuritis or peripheral nerve injury, leprosy, diabetic neuropathy, paraplegia, tapes dorsalis. Now if you see this ulcer carefully, and in advanced cases, you will notice that these patients have painless punched out ulcer. What kind of ulcer? Can you see? There is painless punched out ulcer. Okay. And if the patient is having advanced ulcer, right? So generally, in majority of cases, the base is formed by bone. Clear? So see, So these patients have painless punched out ulcer and the base is formed by bone. One question which is frequently asked from the last 3-4 years continuously, and that is staging of pressure sore or pressure ulcer. Now see, it's very easy to remember the staging of pressure sore or pressure ulcer because it is very similar to burns. So you remember burn? What is the first degree burn? That is also known as epidermal burn, in which there is only erythema, no blisters. So in first degree burn, there is only involvement of epidermis, but there is no blisters. Second degree burn is also known as partial thickness burn, and in second degree burn, there is epidermis plus involvement of dermis. What happens in third degree burn? In third degree burn, there is involvement of subcutaneous fat, and in fourth degree burn, the structures which are underlying the skin like muscle, bone, brain, these are involved. So in fourth degree burn, here you can see there is involvement of muscle. So this is the burn classification. Now see the staging of pressure ulcer. Now see, in pressure ulcer what happens? In stage 1, there is only erythema of skin. See, the skin is intact. What happens? There is only erythema of skin. What happens in stage 2? There is involvement of epidermis plus part of dermis. So there is involvement of epidermis plus part of dermis in stage 2. In stage 3, there is involvement of subcutaneous tissue. And in stage 4, there is involvement of underlying structures like muscle or bone. So can you correlate? Clear? So it is very easy for you to remember now both what burn classification and pressure ulcer or pressure sore, because it is almost comparable. Here you can see. Clear? Simple. Now another way to remember the staging of pressure ulcer. Stage 1 is known as early superficial ulcer. Stage 2 is known as late superficial ulcer. Stage 3 is known as early deep ulcer, and stage 4 is known as late deep ulcer. So we are going to discuss in detail with images. Have a look. So here in stage 1, you can see that there is only non-blanchable erythema. There is non-blanchable erythema. Clear? And the skin is intact. So what happens here? There is intact skin. Clear? This is known as early superficial ulcer. So the stage 1 is also known as early superficial ulcer because here there is only non-blanchable erythema, skin is intact. Now in stage 2, what you can notice that there is loss of epidermis plus part of dermis. So what kind of skin loss is there? It's partial thickness skin loss. So here there is partial thickness skin loss, and in this case there is involvement of what? Epidermis, and apart from epidermis there is involvement of part of dermis. Clear? What is the other name of this stage 2? This is known as late superficial ulcer. So the other name is late superficial ulcer. Now here you can see in stage 3 there is involvement of what? Skin. So there is full thickness skin loss. Apart from that, here you can see that there is involvement of subcutaneous tissue also. So can you see this? This is the ulcer involving full thickness of skin, means epidermis, dermis. Along with that, subcutaneous fat is also involved. Clear? So what you can see that there is granulation tissue in the base or beneath. So what you can see here? You can see the granulation tissue. So generally this is known as early deep ulcer. This is early deep ulcer. So in this stage 4, if you can see, there is involvement of skin plus subcutaneous fat plus structures located beneath skin like muscle and bone. So here you can see subcutaneous tissue is involved. Here you can see muscle is involved, and here you can see bone, and you can see the base is formed by bone. Clear? So this is a stage 4 pressure ulcer where you can find the bone and muscle. So base is formed by bone, and this is known as what? Late deep ulcer. So how to remember? Stage 1 early superficial ulcer, stage 2 late superficial ulcer, stage 3 early deep ulcer, stage 4 late deep ulcer. Nowadays, image-based questions are asked, especially in AIIMS and NEET. How to identify? See, if you can see the bone or muscle, it's clear-cut case of stage 4. And if you can see only granulation tissue, nothing else, yes, it is stage 3. And if the skin is intact, it is stage 1. And if only there is partial thickness skin loss involving epidermis and part of dermis, then it is stage 2. Now see what's the management. In cases of pressure ulcer or pressure sore, what? Prevention is better than the treatment. So how we can easily prevent the pressure ulcer or pressure sore? So it can be prevented by good skin care. There should not be underhydration or overhydration. Especially we have to direct our paramedical staff that whenever we are shifting the patient, we have to lift the patient. We are not supposed to drag the patient. And we have to use special pressure dispersion cushions or foams. You have seen in the wards that patients who are confined to the bed for long duration of time, especially quadriplegic or paraplegic patient. So we are using air fluidized beds or use of low air loss beds. Means sometimes you have noticed that we are using water mattress also. And if urinary and fecal diversion is required, we should go for that. So these are the methods by which we can prevent the pressure ulcer or pressure sore. Now see what are the special instructions which are given to the patients as well as the relatives. If patient is bed bound, so patient should be turned every 2 hourly. How to remember? There are 2 words in bed bound. This is one, bed bound. So since there are 2 words in bed bound, the patients who are bed bound, they should be turned every 2 hourly. This is a question. Every 2 hourly. Okay. Now see, if a patient is wheelchair bound, wheelchair bound. Now see how many letters are there in wheel? 5 letters. And how many letters in chair? 5. So total how many letters? There are 10 letters. It means this patient should lift off the seat. These patients should lift off their seat every 10 minutes for 10 seconds. So what? Every 10 minutes. The patient should lift off their seats for 10 seconds. Okay. So now you will not forget that in bed bound, since 2 words are there, so the patient should be turned every 2 hourly. And if the patient is wheelchair bound, wheelchair, total 10 letters are there, so patient should lift off themselves from their seat every 10 minutes for 10 seconds. So this is how we can prevent. Now see, if there is no improvement after conservative management, in those cases we have to go for surgical intervention in patients of pressure sore. So surgical intervention. So generally in which patients we go for surgical intervention? If there is no improvement after conservative management. No improvement. Clear? After conservative management. Now see what are the options in surgical intervention. So you have seen that certain patients who are having bed sore, especially near sacrum, and there is presence of slough or necrotic material, and you have noticed sometimes intern of first year PG is doing debridement. So if there is presence of slough or presence of necrotic material, clear? In that case, we have to go for adequate debridement. Now what is vacuum assisted closure or negative pressure wound therapy? It improves healing. We will discuss in detail because this is another important topic. So vacuum assisted closure or negative pressure wound therapy, it improves the healing of bed ulcer or bed sore. In certain cases, suppose there is a defect like in sacrum or at bony prominences. In those cases, after adequate debridement, when there is granulation tissue, and we have to cover that particular defect. So how we are going to cover that defect? We are going to cover that defect with flap closure. what kind of flap is required here? Here we need a large myocutaneous flap. Myo means which contains muscle, cutaneous means skin. So we need a large myocutaneous flap with intact sensory innervation. Now the question is asked, what is the most commonly used flap in cases of pressure ulcer or pressure sore? And the most commonly used flap, is the extensor fascia lata flap with which nerve? Lateral cutaneous nerve of thigh. You have to remember, because this is very, very important. The most commonly used flap is extensor fascia lata with lateral cutaneous nerve of thigh. So this is used to cover that defect. Now see this image. This was an image based question in NEET PG. So what is this? Here you can see that there is application of a sealed dressing, and with this sealed dressing you can notice that vacuum is applied. Clear? So here vacuum is applied with sealed dressing, and that's why here the wound is closed with the help of vacuum. So this is known as vacuum assisted closure. And in this case, since the vacuum is applied, we are going to apply a negative pressure of minus 125 mmHg. And since negative pressure of minus 125 mmHg is applied, other name of this dressing is negative pressure wound therapy. So what's the name of this? This is vacuum assisted closure, also known as negative pressure wound therapy. So here we are going to apply a sealed dressing and we create the vacuum. Now question, if it's negative pressure wound therapy, how much pressure is applied? Minus 125 mmHg. Clear? Next, we apply this negative pressure continuously or intermittently. So both. We can apply it continuously also and intermittently also. Clear? You have to be careful. So we have to change the dressing 2 to 3 times every week. Clear? Now see what is the advantage of applying the vacuum. If you are going to apply the vacuum, whatever the extra secretions are there, those secretions are being drawn out. One, and second, it is going to improve the vascularity. So the secretions are being drawn and it is going to improve the vascularity, and because of this there is faster healing. So there was another question in NEET, that what are the primary effects of negative pressure wound therapy? So first is macro deformation. What is macro deformation? When the pressure is applied, negative pressure, what? The wound edges are drawn towards each other. So what happens? It helps in wound approximation, and if it helps in wound approximation, it leads to faster healing. So in macro deformation, it leads to wound edges approximation. So edges approximation. Clear? Second, what happens in stabilization of wound environment? Since a sealed dressing is being applied, so what? It is going to protect the wound from external condition, from microorganisms. And second, it is going to provide warm and moist environment. So there is stabilization of wound environment. First, it protects the wound from external condition, and it is going to provide warm and moist environment. Okay, we discussed that it is going to suck the extra secretions, so it is going to reduce edema. And what do you mean by micro deformation? It promotes the cellular proliferation at the wound surface. So what? It promotes cellular proliferation. Clear? So the wounds which are chronic, means not healing and present there for more than 3 months, especially the pressure sores or pressure ulcer, this technique is very effective in the peeling. But there are certain contraindications of negative pressure wound therapy. So what are the contraindications of negative pressure wound therapy? So the contraindications are, first, malignancy in the wound. So if there is malignancy, it's contraindicated. if patient is having untreated osteomyelitis, or there is non-enteric and undrained fistula, and if patient is having necrotic tissue with SR, in these cases it is contraindicated. And now how to remember, and the mnemonic is Munna. Clear? Munna Bhai MBBS. So Munna. Clear? So malignancy in wound, untreated osteomyelitis, non-enteric and undrained fistula, presence of necrotic tissue with SR. So these are the contraindications of negative pressure wound therapy. Now see the questions related to scar formation. Scar formation. So why there is formation of scar? So it is the maturation phase of wound healing which leads to formation of scar. So it is in which phase? In maturation phase. So maturation phase of wound healing leads to formation of scar. Clear? So there are two types of scar, normal scar. One is immature and one is mature. Now see these two images and tell me which one is immature and which one is mature. Now see this one. This is pink, hard, and you can see the level raised, and generally it's itchy. So this is pink, hard. Can you see the level? It is raised, and generally these kind of scars are itchy. Clear? And here you can see that it's not very clearly visible, but you can make out that there is scar here. This scar, if you see, it's paler, softer, and it's flat. And generally in such kind of scar, there is very lesser itching or there is no itching. So itching diminishes. So this is paler, it's flat, it is soft, and here itching diminishes. Clear? So you tell me which one is immature scar and which one is mature scar. So you can see the first one is immature. So these are the types of normal scar. This is immature scar and this is mature scar. Okay. So what happens in mature scar? There is maturation of collagen and the collagen becomes denser. Simultaneously what happens? There is decreased number of fibroblast and the vascular tissues. So blood vessels are going to decrease, fibroblasts are going to decrease in number, especially in the mature scar, and that's why it appears paler. It is flat, it is soft, and there is lesser itching. Now comes the question that what are the types of abnormal scar? And the types of abnormal scars include atrophic scar, atrophic, hypertrophic scar. So there is hypertrophy or excessive scar tissue, and keloid. In both hypertrophic scar and keloid, there is excessive scar tissue. In hypertrophic scar, it is confined within the boundary of wound or incision, and in keloid, it extends beyond the boundary of wound or incision. So see the types of abnormal scar. Now you can see this scar. This is pale, it is flat or depressed, and you can see it is stretched. So atrophic scar is pale, flat or depressed, and it is stretched. Why it is known as atrophic scar? Because there is atrophy of epidermis and dermis. So the name of this scar is atrophic scar. Why atrophic scar? Because in these patients there is thin epidermis and dermis, and that's why these kind of scars are easily traumatized. So you can see the appearance. It is pale, flat or depressed, and it is stretched. Clear? So generally on which sides it is seen? Most commonly it is seen on back. So it is seen on back. You have seen certain patients who are having nodulocystic acne. After healing of that nodulocystic acne, can you see? You have noticed this kind of atrophic scar. So this is atrophic scar. What is the problem? Some surgeons or some cosmetic surgeons, what mistake they do? they are going to excise this scar and they are going to resuture the scar. But the problem, since there is thin epidermis and dermis, even you excise the scar and resuture it, what the results are not very satisfactory. Clear? So this is the problem with atrophic scar. Now see this scar. Can you see? Here you can see that there is excessive scar tissue, but it is confined to boundaries of wound or boundaries of incision. So what kind of scar is this? It is hypertrophic scar. So the name of this scar, it is hypertrophic scar. Clear? So here excessive scar tissue doesn't extend beyond the boundaries of wound or incision. So here there is excessive scar tissue, excessive scar, and it doesn't extend beyond the incision or wound. Clear? Now what is the problem? Why in certain patients you are going to see that there is hypertrophic scar? In these patients, in wound healing, there is prolonged inflammatory phase. So one reason is there is prolonged inflammatory phase, and second, there is unfavorable scar siting. It means suppose you are giving incision against the tension lines or perpendicular to the tension lines. So what is the reason? It results from first prolonged inflammatory phase, and unfavorable scar siting means incision across the tension lines. Incision across the tension lines. Clear? Nowadays certain questions are asked in pathology also related to the histological features. So if you see the histology, there is excess collagen. And what kind of collagen is seen? There is well organized type 3 collagen. And apart from well organized type 3 collagen, there is hypervascularity. So see the histological features. So on histology, first there is excess collagen. And what kind of excess collagen? It's type 3, and this is well organized. Okay, what happens in keloid? In keloid also there is excess collagen, but it is not arranged properly. It is arranged in random fashion, and there is hypervascularity. Clear? What is the good thing about hypertrophic scar? That it improves over a period of time. Now imagine if hypertrophic scar is going to persist, how we are going to manage the hypertrophic scar? So see, management of hypertrophic scar. Now see, if there is linear hypertrophic scar, in linear hypertrophic scar we go for pressure therapy. And what we do generally, we are going to apply silicon gel sheet. So there is silicon gel sheet application in linear hypertrophic scar. Now sometimes what happens, there is ongoing hypertrophy. If in the scar there is ongoing hypertrophy, then we are supposed to inject the steroid. Where exactly? Beneath the scar. So that is known as intralesional injection of steroids. And generally which agent we are going to inject? Which one? Triamcinolone. Clear? So intralesional injection of triamcinolone. In certain patients, the scar is going to persist for more than 1 year. And if it is going to persist for more than 1 year, in that case we have to excise the scar, and after that we have to close it. So what is the treatment? Surgical excision with primary closure. Generally, hypertrophic scar improves spontaneously with time. Now tell me, what is the name of this condition? You can notice what? That there is excessive scar tissue and it extends beyond the boundaries of original incision or wound. So the name of this condition is keloid. So this is keloid. So this is characterized by excessive scar tissue and it extends beyond the boundaries of original wound or incision. Now see, what is the etiology? It is unknown, but it is associated with increased level of growth factors. So it has been seen that the patients who are having increased growth factors, in those patients it's common. Second, it is common in darkly pigmented races. So that's why you will notice that it is more common in blacks. And there is some genetic predisposition also. Now see the site. If you notice, it is generally seen in a triangular area. Clear? And what is that triangular area? If we are going to join these two shoulder tips with xiphisternum, so shoulder tips and xiphisternum, so this is the triangular region in which you are going to find the keloid. There are certain other areas also. So generally, what is the most common site? You can see here, the most common site is sternum. Clear? It is also seen in this supraclavicular region. It is also seen in face. Where exactly? In the ear. In ear, where exactly? Near ear lobule. So sternum, above clavicle. It is seen in upper extremity. It is seen in face, and in face where exactly? Generally in ear. Clear? So these are the common areas where you will find the keloids. Now see the histological features. What you see here in keloids. So we discussed in hypertrophic scar that there was excess collagen. Clear? And there was hypervascularity. What kind of excess collagen was there? Type 3, and it was well organized. Now see here, it is disorganized. What? Type 1 and type 3 collagen. So here it is disorganized type 1 and type 3 collagen. Simultaneously there are thicker collagen bundles. Right? Now see the problem with keloids. The problem is that it rarely regresses with time. So it rarely regresses. And what is the second problem? That it is generally refractory to medical and surgical management. So this is generally refractory to medical and surgical management. But if patient is having keloid, we have to go for some kind of treatment. Okay. So what is the management option if patient has keloid? See, what is the first line treatment? The first line treatment, and in first line treatment again we have to go for pressure therapy. So what we go for? We apply silicone sheets. Clear? And simultaneously intralesional injection of triamcinolone. So we go for intralesional injection of steroids, and the agent is triamcinolone. Clear? Now imagine there is no improvement even after this pressure treatment and intralesional injection of triamcinolone after 12 months. Even if there is no improvement after 12 months, this is known as refractory keloid. So if there is no improvement after 12 months, it's a refractory case. Clear? Okay. So if patient is having refractory keloid, in these cases we have to excise the keloid and we have to go for post-operative radiotherapy. What kind of radiotherapy? We either give external beam radiotherapy or brachytherapy. So in these patients we go for excision plus post-op radiotherapy. Okay. And what are the options? We go for external beam radiotherapy or we go for brachytherapy. So these are the treatment options for keloid. So in exams, hypertrophic scar and keloids are frequently asked. So let's see what are the differences between hypertrophic scar and keloid. So see, hypertrophic scar is not familial, but this keloid can be familial. And hypertrophic scar is not race related, but we discussed that keloid is more common in darkly pigmented races, so it is more common in blacks as compared to white. And generally, keloids are more common in females, whereas hypertrophic scars are equally common in males and females. If you see the age distribution, hypertrophic scar is generally seen in younger patients, especially in children, whereas the age for keloid is 10 to 30 years. So we discussed that in hypertrophic scar, excessive scar tissue remains within the wound margin, and in keloid it extends beyond the wound margin, right? What is the site? You saw the hypertrophic scar. Generally it is seen on flexor surfaces, and we discussed what is the site of keloid. It is seen in this triangular region bounded by shoulder tip and xiphisternum, and overall most common site is sternum. Other sites are, it is seen in supraclavicular region, seen in face, especially the ear lobule. Now etiology. So unfavorable scar siting. So we discussed, if you are giving incision across the tension line, and what is the etiology in keloid? We discussed that it is unknown. Generally the hypertrophic scar, you have to remember this, hypertrophic scar develops within 4 weeks of incision or surgery, and keloid develops 3 months to 1 year, after 3 months to 1 year. And if you are going to examine the hypertrophic scar, you saw that hypertrophic scar is raised, there is some amount of pruritus, and generally it is going to respect wound edges. In cases of keloid, there is pain and there is itching, pruritus, and it grows beyond wound boundaries or margins. Sometimes the differences are asked related to histology. So we noticed that in both there is excessive collagen and there is hypervascularity. We discussed that in hypertrophic scar there is well organized type 3 collagen, whereas in keloid there is type 1 and type 3 collagen, and it is not well organized and it is not properly oriented. So these are the differences between hypertrophic scar and keloid.